Okay. Okay, well, it's 6 o'clock. I guess if anyone joins us, they join us. So welcome all to the formal Climate Change Working Party. It's been a while, but we have been meeting behind the scenes informally, specifically around the local plan, work on the emission reduction pathway, and some other bits and pieces along the way. So hopefully we might be able to pick up some of that as the agenda goes forward. So just a little bit of housekeeping first. I'm aware that there's a few people to be wanting to be co-opted, but there is a bit of a problem in terms of administrating that at the moment. And I think what we've decided at the moment is we do have Parveen, who's a representative from the Interfaith Council. I think that we're keen to co-opt at the moment, but for anyone else, if you could just please bear with us. I think hopefully in May, we'll have a bit of a better idea about how we're going to manage these meetings going forward, and perhaps think about the membership of the group as well, and how we might want to do that to be a bit more representative going forward. So if you are in the waiting room currently, we're happy to admit you for your questions, should you have one. But if you do want to take part in the, well, if you do want to see the rest of the meeting, you'll be able to do that on YouTube. And I think for anyone that did have eyes on being a co-optee, perhaps we could have a conversation offline a bit about that, just in terms of managing it, because it'll be unwieldy for admin and we need to just get the meeting flowing, I think is my sense. So just a bit of housekeeping throughout the meeting. If you do want to speak on something, please do raise your digital hand and we'll try and keep an eye on that, or make a comment in the chat box, but try not to have many chats in there as opposed to actually just making reference that you want to speak. So okay, let's get started. I guess as well, just for the benefit of the public, when you do speak, if you're just able to say who you are and what sort of area you're representing, that'd be really helpful for the people at home. So do we have any substitutes or apologies for the meeting? I'm just aware of a couple, which is Adrian Horton from Slow the Flow, and yeah, there was another one, but I've forgotten. So could anyone fill in the blanks for me, please?
Yeah, I'm just checking now. There was Adrian Horton and another.
Yeah, it's gone out of my head.
Can I come back to you? And
we did have another. We did have another. We'll get there. We accept their apology, whoever they are.
Right.
It's okay. Yeah, we'll move on. We'll move on. So admission of the public. Yeah, we've sort of mentioned the constraints about that, and we'll try and manage our way best around that. So if you have joined to speak, then there will be a portion of this meeting where you'll be able to do that. So in terms of the minutes of the meeting last held, which was last year on the 16th of November, I'm looking for anyone to approve them as a correct record, if they're able. I'm looking at Councillor Jenny Lynn. Thank you. Do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Colin Hutchinson. Sorry if I can't see. There are two screens to monitor here. That will do, though. So we'll move on to the question time section, and this, we've got about half an hour to do this, so I'm not sure how many we've got in the waiting room. I'm aware of at least a couple of questions. We've got a Hazel Draper, I believe, has a question. So can we let Hazel in if she's not already in admins, and to ask her question?
Could I have that name again, please, Chair?
Hazel Draper. I see her. She is now popped up and is waving. Hi, Hazel.
Yeah.
So you've got a question. Go for it.
DEFRA recently announced legislation on the banning of burning in some peatlands, but there are lots of loopholes in it. and it only includes deep peat and in areas of scientific interest. And there's a real lack of clarity on what those locations will be, how it's going to be managed and so on. I know that you're really good on land management and the impact on climate change and slowing the flow and stuff. I was wondering if the council has plans to object to DEFRA's legislation and to request for more transparency and also for public consultation on the legislation.
Okay. Does anyone have any comments on that specifically before we sort of go away and think about the possibilities of what we might do going forward? I definitely take your point. I guess the first thing I'd like to do is map and see what in terms of our uplands and land falls between the cracks in terms of what is and isn't going to be suitable for working within the DEFRA framework. I guess that might be the first thing I'd want to do, identify where works and where doesn't. So that might be a piece of work that we do. I think ostensibly, yeah, we want to make sure that it's got teeth, don't we? And that it means something for the landowners so that they're able to engage with the process. So beyond that, I think that's definitely something we can go away with and perhaps furnish you later with a bit more of a detailed response offline, if that's helpful. I don't know if anyone else wants to feed in, but otherwise, Jenny, Councillor Lynn.
Yes, I think it's a great question, Hazel. Thank you very much. Thanks for drawing our attention to it. I think that's really good. I think we do need to take a look at what the implications are for Calderdale. Councillor Patience is quite right. I also think it's probably worth engaging with our countryside section, as well as obviously with interested community organisations that have really been up on this issue. I know that there was a local access forum meeting that involved a number of people, including our own countryside service last night. So yes, I think we certainly need to have a look at it and then come back on it. What I wasn't sure about was whether there was a time scale on this, or whether it's simply that we need to, so if there is, anyway, we need to do that, and I'm sure officers, Jez and Sam can advise us on that. But thank you for your question. I think it's very timely. Thank you.
Yeah, very much so, and there's good detail in there. So if we can get into a bit of a to and fro with you on email and work out the details on that, that'd be really helpful. Please feel free to stay for the remaining portion of this time as an observer, or however you want to do it. But yeah, thanks for your question. I do have, is there anyone else specifically that has a question that is referenced? I do have another one. I do have another couple of questions from Councillor Taylor referring to one of the items in future. So thank you. I'll read them out and we'll attempt
Scott, in the chat, there's a Robert Bayliss who would like to ask questions.
Thank you, Councillor Hutchinson. We'll let Robert come in first then, and then we'll deal with that question directly after. Hi, Robert. Are you with us yet? There you are. You've appeared. And there you are. Hello, Robert.
Hi. Hello, Chair. Yeah, thanks for inviting me in to ask questions. I've got actually a series of questions about the reports to be discussed. To make it easy for minuting, shall I read those questions out?
Please do.
Or do you want them to be raised when the reports come up?
It depends how weighty they are. I mean, are they?
Okay. Okay. Well, well, I'll start with if I cover the carbon neutral fund, which is the first one. Those are probably the most weighty questions.
Okay.
So the report is good at highlighting the fact that the £1 million fund is a first step, and that there's a huge investment necessary to decarbonise council operations and neutralise community emissions. Despite the council's own 2038 net zero carbon target, it's clear that global emissions need to be cut by 50% by 2030, and the UK's by more. And Boris Johnson has actually committed to 68%, and I can't remember the baseline. With that in mind, what chances are that Calderdale's carbon emissions can be reduced by at least 50% this decade with such a small amount of investment in the coming year and no ongoing programme of investment imminent? Now, there may be something in hand, but you know, we're on the table at the moment is only 1 million, and there's a hell of a lot more to spend to get to a 50% reduction by 2030.
I mean, I think on that we probably need to not take the £1 million in isolation and think that's the only investment into decarbonisation that's happening within the council. That's probably a broader thing in terms of how we're managing capital projects, how we're building houses, how we're looking at estate, how we're, you know, thinking about the climate change sort of in-house work that we're doing on how the council runs. So perhaps there's a broader thing there to drill down, but clearly you're right in terms of what's needed to get there. We do need more policy change from a regional, national level. There needs to be massive amounts of more investment. And I think, yeah, take your point, it can't just be £1 million that we throw at it and hope to solve all our problems. But it's part of the solution, and I think it gets the community involved, and that's going to be really important in terms of matching that money from CFFC, which we've already got a bit of a commitment towards, and thinking about what those community projects can look like. But I entirely take your point, but perhaps we could work up a more detailed answer to that we could get to you if indeed some of your answers aren't questioned with it and answered within the discussion itself later.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Would you like me to ask my next question about the Carbon Neutral Fund?
Go for it.
Right, that might need a written answer as well. In order for the council to lead in decarbonisation of its own operations, at least in line with that 50% we just talked about, will the council consider seeking private sector skills, resources and investment in deep energy conservation retrofits of council buildings, zero carbon transport and heat networks, along with renewable energy technologies coupled with battery storage and/or hydrogen electrolysis? If not, why not? Private sector financial support has the potential to overcome the dilemma of having to tackle the climate emergency at the same time as being constrained by inadequacies in available public sector finance. The council could explore obtaining private finance from energy services companies through joint ventures or energy performance contracts that include incentives based on a share of the resultant revenues and revenue savings. This approach might also be explored as a means of supporting the need to tackle the community's carbon emissions and fuel poverty.
Robert, I detect that this is something you have a keen interest and expertise in based on that particular question. So what I'm not going to try and attempt to do is to answer that right now. And I think you're right, unless one of the other officers wants to come in, I think what we'll do is, provide you with a detailed answer to that, if that's okay.
Thanks. I mean, I'm asking it in the context that I know the council hasn't got a lot of money, and there's a lot of money needed to retrofit. It's not just new buildings and new projects, it's existing operational matters that need, and buildings that need to be tackled. And I think the money needs to come from somewhere, and this is one avenue. Yeah,
clearly you're right, and clearly there's perhaps opportunities we could explore with devolution along the way as well. But yeah, I take your point entirely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And did you have one final question, or was that it?
I think I've taken up enough of your time. I can raise the rest of the questions.
Okay.
Later.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah.
Okay. Unless that, Finn.
Could I just suggest that instead of just sending the answers to Rob, could you send the answers to all members of the working group? Thanks.
Of course. Thank you. And okay, Anthony, briefly, please. Sorry. You're on mute. There you go. No. There you go.
Thank you, Chair. Mine was going to be a matter arising from the minutes, but I mentioned to you in an email earlier that I was going to be late. My matter arising or question isn't a brief one, so I'm quite happy to try and find a space later.
No. Go for it. Go for it now. It's fine.
Thank you. As people will see from the minutes of November, there was a question raised about the inconsistency between the local plan, which Friends of the Earth believes it doesn't demonstrate that it's going to bring about sufficient carbon reduction, and the climate emergency strategy, which needs to achieve radical reductions, as Robert Bayliss has just been talking about. So I just wanted to let members of the public know that that question was asked in November. It was followed up by another meeting, and certainly this environmental stakeholder wasn't satisfied with the answer. We still believe that there's a contradiction at the top level of Calderdale strategies, but that's not my question, Councillor Patient. In the minutes, it was what we talked about as one of the programs driving possible increased carbon emissions was the corridor improvement programs, which are funded from the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, and there are quite a number of them throughout Calderdale, and they underpin the local plan. That's the connection. Now, as you know, Councillor Patient, at the Green Economy Panel, the Combined Authority Green Economy Panel on Friday, the issue was raised about when the audit of those schemes, which was commissioned by the Combined Authority in January, when was that audit going to be completed? And specifically, since there had been agreed and an opt-out that those schemes which had got to a particular stage in the business plan wouldn't be included within the audit. And as you know, because the chair asked this question specifically, and I'm grateful to him having done so, it was agreed that only those corridor, in this case, the corridor improvement programs, which had got to contract stage, would be excluded from the audit. So we know that that audit is going to be ready in a few months' time. And the question that I want to ask is, since we know from the work that has been done by Element Energy, and we saw some of that recently, that transport emissions have got to reduce from about 400,000 tonnes or above to about 200,000 tonnes in 2030. So there's a really major carbon reduction required over the next decade. Is Calderdale prepared to consider the results of that audit when it arrives, and, if you like, anticipate the fact that presumably many of the corridor improvement program schemes are going to be included within that audit? They're going to be audited, and we will find out the carbon impacts of those schemes. Is Calderdale anticipating that that those schemes are going to have to face an audit?
Sorry, Anthony, you've just hit mute about 10 seconds ago.
Sorry, it's obviously my enthusiasm here, but I'm almost finishing. So my question was: is Calderdale prepared to anticipate the fact that those schemes are going to be audited, and if it's found out that they are incompatible with a reduction in transport carbon emissions identified by Element Energy from about 400,000 tonnes a year to 200,000 tonnes by 2030. Is it prepared to contemplate the cancellation or modification of those schemes? And I'm asking this question now, not to grandstand or anything like that. I'm trying to put the council on notice that the contradiction that I talked about between carbon strategy and local plan strategy is likely to come into effect and be visible when the audit of those corridor improvement program schemes becomes visible, which will be within a number of a relatively short time. And I'd like the council to be preparing for that, identifying which schemes are not yet at contract stage, and then be prepared to start to review those schemes for their carbon impacts. Sorry for the length of that, but you can see the significance of the question. Thank you.
No, thank you, Anthony. Thanks as always for your questions. Lots of sort of detail in there and really picking apart of what was mentioned at the Green Economy panel. No, certainly I think we'd be remiss not to take the results of that report into account in terms of everything we do future. So I can certainly guarantee that we will make a robust response to whatever comes in there. And I know certainly it's not something you would let us go away with. So yeah, for sure. I think we must do that and must look at what that means for any capital projects going forward. But in terms of the detail, I'm happy to sort of formulate a more detailed response to that offline that might help allay some of your fears. I have one more question. Well, I have a sort of three-part question from Councillor Taylor that I'm going to ask. It does refer to a later item, so it might well be that we cover the devil in the detail of it later on. It's broadly about what advice did we get about this is pertaining to item 10, which is specific. Well, not item 10, sorry. It's specifically the item about zero carbon council pensions and investments that we have later. And he asks a number of questions around that, about what advice have we taken to make that particular statement, what scientific advice have we decreed that fossil-free and sustainable finance by other investors and levels of government will benefit the pension fund members, and a further question about just the general recommendation and why we're taking these steps to divest. I don't think it would be right to answer that now. I think we can broadly present that item later and have a bit of a robust discussion, and hopefully some of those questions will be answered then. So unless anyone else has any specific questions, can we keep moving? Is that okay? I'm not seeing any signs that anyone else wants to chat at this point. So just to say, everyone that did ask questions, thank you very much for them. We'll endeavour to get you those responses as soon as humanly possible. Won't be tomorrow, but we'll get it to you shortly. So thank you, and please do stay and observe, or however you want to. We are streaming on YouTube. I'm not going to take up a load of the time with the chair's report, because I think there's some quite meaty bits on there, and I don't want to sort of grandstand the space. Anthony made reference to the fact that, oh, sorry. Thank you, Janet. That was a good point to make. Does Peter, do you want to ask anything specifically? Sorry, we do have a call-in member here, so I need to be constantly monitoring that. So, Peter, I'm registering by your silence that you don't want to speak at this time. I'll try and make sure that within each item I come to you. And I did miss one other bit out. Oh, hello.
Councillor Patient, he's got his he's on mute at the moment. Tilly, can you unmute him, please?
I can only ask him to unmute. I can't unmute him myself.
Right, okay.
He actually appears to have gone.
Okay. Right. Okay. There's not much we can do about that at this point. So hopefully he'll sort his tech issues out, and just feel free to interrupt at any point, Peter. We'll bear with you. And just one other piece of news that I forgot to mention before we move on is just to welcome Paveen Hussain who's a representative from the Interfaith Council. Really welcome your input here and bring some new, fresh ideas as well. So do you want to just say a quick hello to the group and introduce yourself? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Not at all. Thank you very much. Perveen Hussain, yeah, I'm a trustee with the Calderdale Interfaith, and I run the women's section as well. I'm on various other committees as well, and I have a keen interest in sustainability really, and how we get there. So I'll be happy to give my perspective whenever it's needed.
Brilliant, brilliant. Welcome, and feel free to say anything that takes your mind. There's any questions are relevant, so we welcome any of your input. So thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm not going to take up any of the chair's update. I only have stuff about the green economy panel, and those minutes are readily available. There's one point in there about the emission reduction pathway work that's being done. For those of you that aren't aware, we've asked Element Energy to do a similar piece of work for us in Calderdale, drilling down on what specifically we might need to do in terms of decarbonisation. Again, we can do a sort of more broader roundup of that later within other items. So do any of our co-optees have any updates they wish to share at this point? I have one update specifically from Slow the Flow. Adrian Horton isn't here this evening, but he's asked me to pass on that they are currently looking for 3 more trustees to join their board. So specifically with these 3 skill sets in mind: education, legal, and fundraising. So if any of you guys are aware of anyone that might fit that bill, I think they're going to be doing some press about it this week. So likely you'll see stuff on Facebook and or Twitter. But if anyone springs to mind, then do push them in Slow the Flow's direction. That'd be really good. So I've done that for them. I'm aware, sorry, briefly, I'm being told by admin that I need to nominate Perveen to be co-opted officially. So am I just able to see a quick throw of hands that everyone's happy with that, please? And then we'll move on. Yep, I'm going to take that as read. Okay, thank you, everyone. And I see Finn and Will first with their hands up for updates. So in that order, please, and I'll try and monitor the chat.
I'll try and be quick, but Councillor Patient has asked me to mention a couple of things. First of all, I represent Pennine Community Power and not BEAD. Pennine Community Power commissioned 2 big reports, about 100 pages each, from some consultants called Miralis. One was on EV charging, and one was on possible PV solar panels and wind turbines in mainly the Upper Calder Valley. And those 2 reports will shortly be made available publicly if you want to have a look. There's a lot of interesting points in there. Secondly, we have asked the Blacksaw Parish Council whether they are interested in spending up to £10,000 on some research to do heating of houses that are off the gas grid. The minutes of the last meeting in the working group is not quite correct on that point, but so we are waiting for a reply from the council on that one. And we recently had our AGM, and we decided to give £1,200 to the community foundation. After the AGM, we had some noise problems with our community wind turbine that we are working very hard to put right. In terms of Adrian from Slow the Flow, can I just mention that he's actually speaking at a public meeting on the on the 16th of March at 7:30, if anyone wants to hear him speak. He's speaking along with another guy called Phil Horton, is not a relative, but who's speaking about the difficulties of reaching a net zero. If anyone is interested, I can send you the details. Can I just say that I suggested to the working group that at some point we get a report on the council's aim to become net zero as the council assets, so to speak, and look at its supply chains, because every council has a huge procurement budget and a lot of different suppliers, and it is worth looking at what is called Scope 3 emissions. How does that huge supply chain to the council actually affect emissions? And could the council promote net zero policies and actions in that supply chain so that it goes further afield? Other local authorities are doing that with great success, I have to say. It's about building up a supply chain that we want to see here in Calderdale to implement our policies, because without that supply chain, we just can't. I also mentioned with the working group that with COP26 coming up in Glasgow, I think it will be very good if people from the working group actually went up to Glasgow from the 1st to the 12th of November. The minutes are not quite right there either. But I don't know whether any of the councillors can get inside the UN conference itself, but civic society has got tons of interesting events on running in parallel. And I think it'll be good for us to have a presence and use the whole period up to COP26 to basically promote our agenda. I think one of the big problems is that the public in Calderdale doesn't know about the working group's existence. That's the reality. And we have some stories to tell, and we may as well launch it now, because I think the media will be covered on climate change issues from now until the end of the year. Can I finally also say that it should perhaps be mentioned that Calderdale Council felt it necessary to approve an incinerator in Southbridge for legal reasons. I mean, it's part of the picture. It will increase our emissions along with air pollution, but the council obviously felt forced into accepting it for various legal reasons. And finally, I don't know if I could propose that this working group encourage the cabinet to object to an expansion of the Leeds Bradford Airport, because again, it will increase emissions. It will go contrary to any climate emergency planning. And if the cabinet and the Calderdale Council doesn't take a stand on this, I'm afraid it will lose our credibility. So that's perhaps something for councillors to raise in the cabinet. Thanks.
Thank you, Finn. A couple of points there just to pick out before I move to Will is, yeah, you're definitely right. I think we need to have a presence at COP26. I think we've got a really good, strong story to tell, especially about flooding and the effects that we're already living with in terms of that extreme weather from climate change. So yeah, I think for sure we should be there. We should be going mob-handed and asking for proper sustainable funding, as well as telling the story of Calderdale. And yeah, just to say, I'm one of the signatories of the as an objector for the Leeds Bradford expansion, and I've gone on record to say that I know that the Labour group has also agreed along with that. But yeah, we take your point about perhaps speaking to other cabinet colleagues about that specifically. And yeah, I guess hopefully admin have jotted down all those things so we can come back to some of them as well. Perhaps think about bringing some of those points to the next informal meeting. So thanks, Finn. Will Solomon, please, yeah, go for it.
Hi, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Will Solomon. I'm from Youth Council and then also RECA, which is the Regional Youth Climate Assembly. So for the sort of Youth Council part of that, so the ACE Award, which we set up, which is the school accreditation, is sort of on hold at the moment, obviously because schools are either A, not in at the moment, and B, very dominated by COVID. So we're hoping to relaunch that in September or sometime this year. And then also Make Your Mark came out a few months ago, which is a big youth consultation. So it's done all across the country. And then Plastic Pollution and Climate Change came third of the issues voted for. And then for RECA, and this is kind of on what Finn said about COP26, one of our members is called Safar, and she's the, I have to try and remember a title now, it's the sort of young person for Yorkshire and Humber that's been nominated to definitely go up. And then we've also partnered with a group called the COP26 Task Force, and we're going to do some work around them. We've done a convention with them. I'm also doing a sort of film project with hopefully people in the UK and then in South Africa about water. So we have floods, they have droughts, and it's that kind of comparison, which we're going to be doing some work on. Then RECA's also finished their manifesto, which outlines our sort of 12 key areas on climate change that we want to focus on and we want to see the government, local authorities focus on. I think that's everything I've got. Yeah.
No, that's brilliant. That's a load of stuff. So thanks, Will, and let us know how we can help amplify any of the sort of issues you raised, really, and push them out through our comms. Jenny, did you have your hand up to come back?
Yes, I just wanted to say, I wonder whether, Will, you would be willing to speak to the manifesto and have that as an agenda item at a future meeting. I think that would be really brilliant. And I think it's worth, being you've announced it, and obviously we could have a look at it. But I think it'd be really good if you were willing to do just a kind of short report and presentation on that, to just sort of reinforce the work of the group.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd second that. Brilliant. Thank you, Will. Anthony, I see your hand up.
Just very briefly, because COP26 has been mentioned and about being present at the event, which is in November. I just wanted to mention, as if you like, a balancing point, that there's an important opportunity to influence government before November, and people will have seen that in the recent Cumbrian coal mine decision, where it was argued that local decision, the same could be argued for Leeds Bradford Airport, was inconsistent with what the UK was attempting to do in Glasgow in November. And so that argument can be used now to argue and pressurise the government to do the things that we would like to do. So I would just like, Councillor Patient, if you and your colleagues, both in Calderdale and at the West Yorkshire level, can think about the opportunities of raising issues with government now in the period before we get to COP. By the time you reach September, when the government's net zero strategy will have been published, many of the opportunities will have been closed by then. So there's a window of about 3 or 4 months where the issues which concern Calderdale and West Yorkshire can be raised, because it can be argued, we can't do things in Calderdale or West Yorkshire that you, the government, are asking others to do when it gets to Glasgow in November. So I just wanted to draw that attention, that opportunity. It's a window, but it'll start closing as we get through the summer. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great, Anthony. And I guess that might be something we want to speak about at the next informal. I guess if I could preload that for any other councillors and co-optees to think about what the ask wants to look like, so we can all feed in cross-party and across all of our different areas. I think that'd be really helpful. Thank you for that. So what's just happened? That's incredibly annoying. Sorry, just had some technical issues. Okay, so I think we're done on that. If we're able to move forward to the next item, which is item 8, which is specifically around the carbon neutral fund. Debs, are you presenting that, or?
I was planning to, Councillor Patient, just very briefly, if that's
Brilliant.
okay. Yeah, so this paper sets out the decision that the Cabinet made on the 8th of February to agree the budget spend for the £1 million of capital funding to be invested into measures to help tackle the climate emergency. And what the paper does really briefly is just talk about the purpose of the budget, the fund, and also to just set out that an indicative 50% of it should be spent in terms of projects on the council's own estate to decarbonise or support or help contribute to decarbonisation of the council processes, and that the second 50% should be spent on projects to sort of stimulate activity, community activity around carbon reduction as well, and that would be a partnership with the Community Foundation for Calderdale. And the criteria really being that should be directed to capital projects, but also that some of that funding could be used for soft loans, with repayments basically supporting the sort of revolving funds, or keeping some of that resource for future investment in the community sector, and really important role for this group, I think, Councillor Patient, in sort of influencing the use of that budget, and also receiving reports on the investments that are being made, but also the impact of that investment as well. And I think as was mentioned earlier, that I think a recognition that this is a small contribution to the investment that's going to be needed for us to really decarbonise both the council and meet our targets across the whole borough. But it was a really important starting point. I think the other thing to say that we've mentioned actually a few times, haven't we, in the meeting so far, is that obviously this can be really informed by the work that we're doing on the emissions pathway. So that's work that we're getting some external help in to really understand what are the key measures that we need to take in Calderdale if we're going to achieve the targets that we've set for ourselves. And also I think there's a key link here, Councillor Patient, to the work that we're doing around recovery from COVID as well. And obviously climate emergency is one of the priorities for the recovery plan that we're developing as well. So real opportunity for us to use this resource to pump prime some action both within our organisation, but also stimulate some activity within our communities. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction, Councillor Patient.
Thank you very much, Debs. Just for everyone who isn't aware, Debs Harkin is our Director of Public Health and leads on climate change. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's a really big opportunity for us all, and I'm really excited in this board's role in terms of monitoring and making sure we look at that. I'm going to go a bit rogue. I don't know whose hand went up first, but I'm going to go to Councillor Baker because he hasn't spoken yet. So off you go.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so this fund is welcome. Actually, if you look at what you've got coming up at the March Cabinet meeting, you can see how some of the capital money from this fund, I think it's from this fund, is going to go to help unlock the grant funding that the government is providing. I think it's 2.8 million that they're providing for redoing council buildings to make them more sustainable. But we need the funding in place from the council's funds in order to kind of unlock that funding. So hopefully by having a pot of money like this, so you can leverage additional funds from it. There's two things I guess around like the community funding aspect of it. One is I personally would really like to see a little bit more effort going into insulating the kind of some of the poor housing stock in North Halifax that exists, because a lot of the schemes out there are hard to access, and the government kind of eco voucher scheme is really cumbersome and difficult. You know, you need like 3 quotes from people. You can only do it if like you have like one from category A and one from category B. And I looked at it myself, and it just wasn't suitable for the type of older property I'm living in. There was just nothing that I could do to unlock the other things. And I suspect others in that situation. I just kind of wonder, like, can we meet a couple of objectives at the same time in terms of like giving some young people apprenticeships, like tackling cold homes and damp, which has like a public health knock on, and it has a direct impact of like reducing the CO2 because they're using less energy to heat their homes, and it means they've got more money to then spend in the local economy. So part of me would almost wish a little bit of this fund goes towards maybe just employing a couple of young apprenticeships, getting them trained up on insulating homes, and us just using it. Maybe it'd have to be on a targeted basis from like referrals or people who get picked up through our partners or social care, and just kind of just having a bit of ability to, as a council, like the handyman service, right, we're just going to go and insulate your home for you. And I think that's quite a good way to spend some of it. In terms of like the community fund with Calderdale Community Foundation, you know, I think that's a good idea. And I wonder whether this is, again, you know, I've had that idea of like the voluntary council tax contribution scheme. Is it the sort of thing like when we send out council bills, we could just include like there's this community fund for climate change. Do you want to give £5 a month to contribute to it? So we could like promote that fund and encourage people themselves to invest in it, because it's about all of us doing that, isn't it? And, you know, all of our council tax is just going on social care, the nature of council tax at the moment, but enabling people to donate a little bit extra themselves, or businesses to donate to that fund, I think we could really get a lot more out of it like that.
That's a really good idea. Yeah, thank you. I think that's brilliant. The final part that you mentioned there, specifically around that about that voluntary contribution. Really pleased to sort of see that CFFC are going to be, you know, administering a lot of it, and hopefully we can match fund it so it's actually 1.5 million. That would be great, you know. But I guess we'll have to see how that works more broadly. But yeah, thanks for that. We'll take those points away. Like I said, I was going to go rogue, so I know Finn and Anthony have got their hands up, but I'm going to go to Councillor Hutchinson next because we haven't heard from him. So.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, I fully agree with Councillor Baker that we really need to develop a kind of pipeline of works so that people can have an incentive to develop the skills that they need for retrofit and for installing heat pumps, like so that there is work there for them to actually be doing if they train up. You know, like with Todmorden College coming on stream and providing that kind of training. I'd also like to know whether, you know, a lot of the funding for the transformation to a net zero economy will come through the private sector, will involve private or commercial sources of finance. Do we have the expertise within the local authority to actually line up that kind of funding and understanding of the green finance sources that we can tap into, that we can leverage with this money? And if we haven't got that experience within the council, should we be developing that? So, you know, it's trying to actually make sure that we can sort of pump prime these both the jobs, the training, and the resources, so that we've got projects that are ready to go when funding becomes available for it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. They're really good points as well. Before I come to you, Finn and Anthony, I can see that Peter Roberts is back in the room and is attempting to speak. So are you able to unmute, or access the meeting, Peter. I'm aware it's difficult, but I'm just going to keep trying to come back to you. Feel free, Peter, if you work out the tech or if admin are able to do that, just to interject, and we'll come to you. But in the meantime, I'll just go to Finn and Anthony, please.
Okay, I obviously also welcome this funding. It's a pity it's taking a year to get to this point, but better late than never. Other local authorities have obviously set aside enormous sums. Like one local authority set aside £27 million for climate emergency activities. So I did wonder, I mean, it says that this is a 2-year funding program. Has the council got any plans to including in future annual budgets to set aside more money for this? I know we have to look for money everywhere. We can find it, but it includes the council's own budget, where this million comes from, and it's just I'm kind of hoping that it will be repeated in the years to come and not as a one standalone activity. In terms of raising additional funding, I think it will be good to look again closer on the green bonds idea. Again, a lot of local authorities have actually successfully raised huge amount of funding through green bonds. And I know there's always a risk, but there's also a risk of not doing it, if you see what I mean. So I think it would be good to look seriously at that issue at a future meeting. And finally, could I also ask, it says in the report in point 7.4 that the council's annual carbon emission footprint is 10,000 tons a year. Is it the council's footprint or Calderdale's footprint you're referring to here? It sounds like it's just the council's. Is that right? Thanks.
I'm really sorry, I'm having some technical issues, so I didn't hear a large portion of that. It might just be me. Is anyone?
That would be the 10,000 tons a year would be the council's own operational emissions.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And sorry for missing a large portion of that. Just having some technical issues. Anthony and then Will, please. And I saw Councillor Jenny Lynn with her hand up as well.
Mine is a question, Councillor Patient, you may know the answer to, and it's just in terms of the allocation of this money, to be certain that the council has got the necessary investigative report into the state of Calderdale's peatlands, which is important not just for carbon sequestration, but for flooding purposes, flooding resilient purposes as well. After a number of years, I'm still unclear. I've asked the question many times whether that report is in preparation, whether it's going to emerge at some stage. And the reason why is that the CCC Committee on Climate Change report identified peatlands as being restoration of peatlands as being a very, very cost-effective way of carbon sequestration, much easier, quicker to bring on, and cheaper than afforestation. And you recall, Councillor Patient, when the element were going through the Calderdale study, the first view of that, I was unclear whether they were predicting that Calderdale's peatlands would continue to be emitting emissions, not sequestrating emissions, but emitting them through to 2030 and 2038? And I think the answer is was yes to that. And if you look at, and I'm just leaving this as a question, page 44, it says here in that study, whilst there are some peatland restoration activities ongoing which are likely to be improving the emissions associated with peatlands by, I hope, reducing the ones that are coming out, there is limited evidence as to the quantitative magnitude. So the baseline scenario assumes no change in associated emissions. It seems to me that there's still a gap here in terms of moving our peatlands from emitting carbon at the moment, this is apparently what elements are quantifying, to actually sequestrating them. This is a long-term process, and until we get some a study of that, then we're not going to be able to access the considerable quantity of government funding that is going to be available for peatland restoration over the next years. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's make sure we have that as an item on the next informal meeting so we can explore that, and we'll speak to Hugh Furman and other members of the Countryside team about making that happen if indeed it isn't already doing. But yeah, agree, especially based on Hazel's question earlier, that we need to explore the role of peatlands and what we can do more locally with that. So thank you, Anthony. Will, and then Councillor Regan Dickinson.
My question was on sort of the accessibility of this fund for schools and colleges, because obviously they have different sort of pathways to get different funds. But so obviously schools quite often do a lot of work in like their local community around the environment, like, you know, upkeeping the park opposite and stuff like that. But also around, because we've talked about, you know, upskilling, green jobs. Will this be available for like colleges to pay teachers to retrain so they're you know, equipped to go and teach EV maintenance, flood defencing, that sort of thing? And I think also the accessibility for sort of making sure that they, if it's not open to them, they have the knowledge, and this will probably come in the sort of communications bit, the knowledge of where they can find that funding and stuff. Sorry.
Okay, no, I take your point, and you're right, and I don't know the answer to that question, so I'm going to look towards Jez and or Sam. I mean, maybe that's a conversation we need to have with CFFC about how that's managed, but I don't know if either of you guys have got a sense about whether that's possible or doable. Sam?
Yeah, I think CFFC usually don't work with schools because they're not considered part of sort of the true community sector, because schools have quite a lot of core funding. There is a fund called Salix, which is something schools can access, but that's more around sort of building works and things like that, and energy efficiency projects. I think retraining and education is a really interesting thing, and you've raised some good points. I think it's something we need to talk to Community Foundation Calderdale about, and I don't know if it's the case that we'd need to give funding directly to schools, or if the funding could be given to sort of a community project that would then deliver training or skills work. So there might be a way that we can sort of get around it and make sure that we still get the sort of skills delivery in and look at projects around that without necessarily needing to sort of give the school money directly. So yeah, we can look into that further. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for that. Helpful. Councillor Dickinson, and then I think we're done with that item, but been really good contributions. Go for it, Councillor Dickinson.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I wrote to you, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago with a couple of suggestions, and I suspect that they might be valid for consideration under the this £1 million fund that we're talking about. One of the suggestions was to emulate East Cheshire Council, who are fueling one of their trucks with hydrogen that they're electrolyzing through solar panels at the depot. So realistically, that may be a carbon reduction come virtue signalling exercise. It'd be interesting to look at the numbers involved in terms of whether it actually contributes significantly. But the other suggestion, yeah, but it's nonetheless worth exploring. And the other suggestion, which I wrote to you about was the reusing the old weirs. There's 3, potentially 4 in and around Brighouse on the River Calder, and remodeling them, and that may actually help with flood defence as well, to incorporate turbines. I mentioned it to James, to Councillor Scullion as well, and she was not entirely discouraging, but suggests that the River Calder may not be appropriate, but because it's a fast flowing and high variance river, but that didn't seem to stop the Victorians building mills adjacent to the water source at the time. So I'm just wondering if these suggestions might be possibly noted and explored, and whether any pieces of work could be done to explore their viability.
Thank you, Councillor Dickinson. First of all, I'm very sorry if I didn't get back to an email that you sent me. That's not good of me, so apologies. But
happens to the best of us.
on the weirs, for example, I know that the removal of the feed-in tariff has really affected the sort of viability of doing hydro in and around the area, and you know, the sort of sums stacking up. That's not to say we shouldn't be doing it. So I think, yeah, we're definitely able to explore some of them as part of this bid. So yeah, and like I said, there'll be opportunities, and I think we might even think about the idea of having a working party to look at those bids that come in and how we're monitoring them going forward. So if you've got a specific interest in any particular areas, then hopefully you can feed in as part of that process. But yeah, thank you. Thanks for the questions. And again, apologies for not getting directly back to you.
Well, we're here now, yeah.
Councillor Lynn, yeah, finally.
Sorry, I'm muting myself. Yeah, just very quickly, just a point of information for Councillor Dickinson. You may recall, and certainly I'm sure Jez will recall, that a few years ago, there was a plan to actually incorporate a hydro scheme at Cromwell Bottom. And it was also good because it was going to unlock some European funding, and we all got very excited about it. But for various reasons, I think the main one being that Yorkshire Water were very concerned that they had a kind of a monitoring station in terms of river levels and so on there, and the cost of actually moving and relocating that monitoring station was going to make it really, really difficult to deliver. And so, but certainly several years ago, we were looking at the possibility of quite a major scheme at Cromwell Bottom, a hydro scheme. So I was really pleased when I heard what Councillor Dickinson had got to say. And of course, we do know, don't we, that Slow the Flow and have done quite a bit of work thinking about potential sites, not just in the main river, but in some of the kind of tributary streams and so on, in terms of possible location for generating things. And I'm sure it's the sort of thing that Finn knows lots about as well. So it might be that there is some mileage in having that as a topic for one of our informal meetings as well. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Councillor. And sadly, Slow the Flow identified that beavers are not suitable for the River Calder, so we're not going to be seeing beavers anytime soon, which is a real shame, sadly. But on that, thank you for all your input on that. It's going to be really important, and you know, as mentioned, it can't just be a one-off. This needs to be something we're keeping on doing and expanding these amounts of money specifically for decarbonisation. But just to say, Finn, it's only one pot. We're trying to bake in climate change and the emergency into everything that we do within the council, and some of that is hard to quantify with figures, but perhaps that might be a piece of work that we want to do going forward in terms of seeing how we're putting decarbonisation into capital projects more broadly across Calderdale. I'm going to move on to Andrew Peacock, who's been very, very patient, waiting for us, who's going to speak to us about the communication priorities for 2021 and sort of present the report that he's come along with. So hi, Andrew.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Patient. That's not my understanding. I was here as I was here as an observer and asked to cover for Lucy primarily. But oh
well, I'm sorry.
Happy to. If you want me to come to a future meeting and do exactly that, I'd be happy to.
No, that's fine. It does have Deb's name next to it, so maybe I've got that wrong, and perhaps you and or I are able to just feed into the discussion more broadly speaking.
I wonder, Jez, was it you that was going to just briefly?
Yeah, actually, I think Sounds like we're all passing the buck here, but I think Sam might be best placed to introduce it, and as you suggest, Chair, other people can interject.
Very poor. Sorry. Thank you, Sam.
All right, thanks everyone. So I'll just speak very briefly about the paper, and then I think what I'm really interested in is hearing all your comments about communications and what you think our priority should be, I suppose, for the rest of 2021. So the first note in the paper is just sort of an update, because we had a communications subgroup meeting where we thought about what how many different stakeholder groups we might want to contact about climate change. We kind of prioritized them, and we picked out a few key priority areas for action. So just to update you on what's happened there, we've been working with Will and the Youth Council on the ACE Award, which, as Will mentioned, has been quite difficult to launch because of coronavirus, but the Youth Council have done a fantastic job in finalising the scheme, and everything is live and ready to go on that, so we hope to pick that up later in the year. My colleague Catherine did some research work with businesses, and that's presented in the paper with some results. And we've also continued to work with community groups that came together to put together a bid for the TNL Climate Fund. So they're called the Climate Collective. One thing the paper proposes is that we actually work with those three sectors as kind of priorities for next year. So that we work with schools and governors to try and form more of a network to help us talk to young people and reach out to families. That we work with businesses to help them firstly be prepared for reducing carbon and respond to climate change, and also then to get their skills and help to help us with decarbonisation programmes. And then thirdly, that we work with the community sector, and obviously that work is strengthened hugely by the £1 million fund we were just discussing. This paper also has got at the end an appendix, a really fabulous document that the comms team have prepared. So comms have been trying to do some almost like a bit of mind mapping about all the different projects out there in the council that have climate links and climate impacts and climate benefits. And the paper at the end, the diagram just sort of tries to theme them and set them all out. And I think that's really helpful. It might be that it's worth us looking at that together when we have the discussion around what the priority is, because actually seeing everything in one place maybe can help you to pick out what's most exciting or where we think there's most of an opportunity to communicate. But obviously, as we mentioned, and I think a couple of people have had interesting suggestions already for how we could use our communication work to support Community Foundation in the creation of a new endowment or direct giving campaigns to generate funds that we can then spend on more community projects. And also people again have been talking a lot about the emissions reduction pathway. So we're due to have the final report in the next month, and there will be a presentation on the report coming back to yourselves as a group. And it might be that, again, we want to think about as a priority, taking some of those findings out to the general public or to businesses or to the community sector. So there's a lot going on. And I think I'll stop talking now and maybe hand back over to Councillor Patient, and be really interested in just sort of listening to your feedback. And I know Andrew's here as well to sort of listen again directly to you, just so we can really make sure that we're taking your steer here on this.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for jumping in there. When we weren't quite sure who was leading on it, it's much appreciated. I see a couple of hands so far. It's a really good report. I hope everyone's had a chance to look at it and digest sort of what the flow. The hands I'm seeing and are Councillor Lynn. I don't know if that's a legacy hand.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Sorry, apologies.
No, that's all right. And in order of what I'm seeing Finn and then Anthony. And perhaps if we hear what they have to say, there might be some more that want to come in.
Very quickly, it was just I think it's a good focus on these three groups as mentioned in the report. But I come back to my previous comment that actually this shouldn't be at the exclusion of the general public. We have to start communicating with the broader public outside those three groupings identified. And you will recall that I, from the start of this working group, has been arguing for a communication strategy. And I think we really should try and formulate one to go beyond. I mean, all credit to the council's website for highlighting what the council is doing. But this group is not just the council, what the council is doing. So I think we need to start thinking about how to go public, particularly in this year of the COP26. Thanks.
That's a really fair challenge. Thanks, Finn. Appreciate that. And perhaps there's a bit here about how we could all individually be pushing out the work of this group as well at the same time. Councillor, I'm going to take Councillor Baker just before you, Anthony. I hope you don't mind.
Should be quite a quick one. So really good to kind of see all the different stakeholders and get that sense of who we're trying to target within the report. And I was pleased to see the kind of actions over the next 6 months, because sometimes I kind of feel like the climate emergency is such that we should be having like actions with dates, with outcomes, and everything should be like action orientated rather than discussion orientated. But I'm sometimes a bit more of a kind of action orientated doer type person. So on that bit where it was kind of over the 6 months, I wonder if perhaps we could have a bit more on, over the year, what is actually going to happen, when is it going to happen, what are timescales. Probably just needs fleshing out a bit. I think if I was a project manager in a team, then I'd probably want to see a little bit more in terms of what the a bit more concrete actions, when and where they were going to happen, and who was going to be doing it, planned out on a bit of a message grid for the year, and kind of when different things were going to be going out and happening.
That's really good. Thank you. I can see Andrew feverishly scribbling things down, so perhaps we can come back to that.
Yeah, like how it aligns, with the council's forward cabinet plan, because at the moment, I've made the point about the cabinet forward plan, but I think there needs to be a bit of alignment with that, and starting to see a bit more, concrete things happening at certain dates and getting them in diaries to make them happen. So thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Baker, much appreciated. Anthony.
I want to link together two things that have already been said. Sam talked about the carbon emissions reduction pathway study, the Calderdale study, being available soon. And those of us who've seen bits of it I was really pleased by the sort of the detail of it. It actually quantified, that we need to do this so many thousand tons and so forth. And the communication strategy at the moment is very focused internally to Calderdale. People tend to respond to communications if they can see an opportunity to act with it. If you simply communicate without the opportunity to act, then it's less effective. Now, depending on what that study tells us, and it's probably going to present us with more problems immediately than solutions, but there may be things in there that will be suitable for communicating. But the second thing that I want to talk about, mention, is to go back to COP26 and the fact that there is a limited window for the likes of Calderdale to be communicating on a much larger scale. And so, Councillor Patient, I think it would be helpful for you to ask, you and your colleagues to ask, Councillor Swift is deputy chair of the combined authority. It would be good to ask what West Yorkshire is doing to communicate about what it wants to try and do within this window before COP26, and the sorts of things, because what the element study is going to reveal, as I said, is more problems than solutions, and we're going to need help. We're going to need help to achieve that, and there's an opportunity for West Yorkshire to communicate in the window before COP26 to government. We want to join in this effort that you're leading, but we're going to need help, and that's a message that so far I regularly.
We've just lost you at the end there, Anthony, but I think we got the flow of what you were saying and how it links back to the need to make a broad statement and a broad comms sort of platform in the year of COP26, and making sure that we're getting those messages across. Sorry, Anthony, we did sort of lose you for a minute, but we got the flow, and we've sort of made a note of everything you've said within that. So thank you. Thanks for your input on that one. Is there anyone else that I've missed, or just sort of having a look in the chat? I think that's okay. I'm guessing we've covered that in its entirety. So thank you. I think we've got some stuff we can work with there, and some bits that perhaps we can explore offline as well, in terms of timeframes and how it matches up with the communication of this group as opposed to actually the council. Yeah, important to make that differential there. So if you don't mind, everyone, I'm going to move on to the next item, which is fairly timely, really. It's the Zero Carbon Council Pensions and Investments item. And I think I'm really pleased that this is here. For those that aren't aware, last year, the UK's biggest pension fund, the government-backed sort of National Employment Savings Trust, moved towards divestment, and that was a massive move that sort of has reverberated around the country. They're not the only one. Other places are moving towards divestment from their from their investments. And what we're sort of asking with this one, or what we want to discuss and get the sense that how this group feels about it, is the need to think about that more broadly speaking, and whether we want to develop a position statement on those pension investments specifically, and think about asking the West Yorkshire Pension Fund to divest in fossil fuels over 3 years, not overnight. I guess to put together an action plan of how they might do that, and to think about if they really think that fossil fuel investment is the way forward for both the environment and for economic reasons. I think we're all aware that dwindling assets of fossil fuels and what that might mean in terms of stranded assets is a real thing, and not just an environmental impact. It's a real thing. So we have someone here on the group who's actually a member of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, who might be able to give a little bit more background on it. But so I'd really welcome your thoughts, Jenny. So it's a big one. I hope everyone's had a chance to read it all and really consider some of the points within. But for me, I feel it's a fundamental thing that we have to do to move towards net zero. And that's just my take, but I am just the chair, and we are a democracy here. So it would be good to hear from all of you, and from specifically from Councillor Lynn first. So off you go, please.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, members of the Working Party, for being prepared to consider this. I think it's really, really important. It's a really, really important issue. I mean, as is mentioned in the report, the former head of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has talked about this concept of stranded assets, and said that it's something that all major companies and organisations need to think about. And what he means by stranded assets is quite simply that there are, a number of our oil, gas and coal producing companies have a balance sheet which sets out the assets which they have. And many of those assets consist of exploration and oil fields and gas fields and so on, which, if we are to have any chance at all of restricting the rise in global temperature, we simply have to leave in the ground. And I think everybody on this call is really familiar with the idea that 80% of what we know, our known reserves at the moment, have got to stay unburned. Otherwise, we cannot achieve our climate change objectives. So, as a member of, I've been involved in the joint advisory group of West Yorkshire Pension Fund for about 6 years, 7 years now. And about a couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to be placed to represent Calderdale on the investment advisory panel. And ever since then, I've been really keen that that panel should take seriously the risk that we have here. Now, as everybody knows, and it's mentioned in the paper, the whole point about the pension fund, and I have to declare an interest because I receive a pension from West Yorkshire Pension Fund. So I've got as much interest as anybody else in trying to maintain the value of that fund. But the primary duty of trustees of any pension fund is to maintain A, the value of assets in that fund, and B, sufficient ongoing income to meet its liabilities as a fund to people who require their pensions to be paid going forward. And so the timescale is really about 25 years that you work on in a pension fund. Now, the problem that we've got is that given, and the figures are given in the paper there, just over 6% of the current assets in the pension fund are tied up in fossil fuel related companies. The problem about that is that unless we time it right, there is every reason to believe that a whole range of governments across the world in the coming decade, and perhaps even, you know, we've got COP26, we've been talking about that in November coming up, but within the next few years, it's likely that there are going to be significant forms of regulation introduced in countries all over the world, which will significantly limit and reduce the amount of fossil fuels that are going to be burned. Now, what that actually, and we want that to happen, but what that, the implication of that for any companies like, you know, the BPs and the Exxon Mobils of this world, is that those assets which sit on their balance sheet are going to become much, much less valuable. And as we've seen, partly as a result, well, mainly as a result of the pandemic, there's been incredible fluctuations in oil prices this year, and that is likely to continue going forward. So even in terms of the dividend income that you're getting from these companies, there's no certainty about it. And one of the most powerful, just very briefly, one of the most powerful slides that I saw a while ago, and apologies for people who've already seen it, is the one that shows Wall Street in New York in 1905 with all these horse-drawn carriages, a photograph of all these horse-drawn carriages going along Wall Street, you know, and trotting along Wall Street with everybody in their little horses and traps. And less than a decade later, in 1913, a photograph taken from the top of the same building, and there's not a horse in sight. There are just lots of motor cars going along. And so the point about that is that there is a tipping point which can arrive very, very quickly, and which can render, you know, if you were involved in the production, the manufacture of tackle for horses and carts and everything, instead of getting into motor cars, you know, you might very well have been, that's an example, a classic example of a stranded asset. Now, the other point to say is that West Yorkshire Pension Fund did a few years ago take notice of the fact that there was a steady move to get out of coal as the primary source of energy for electricity generation in large parts of Europe. And West Yorkshire Pension Fund did actually get rid of its, you know, the investments that it had in coal. So what we're really asking for them to do now is to do likewise, really, with the other fossil fuel investments that they have. Now, it wouldn't be sensible to and that is partly about, and the reason I argue for that is that it's very much about part of my fiduciary duty. And a fiduciary duty, as a member of the investment advisory group, is to protect the assets and the interests of the fund. And I think at the moment that the fund is placing itself at risk by continuing to invest in fossil fuel companies. And unless it judges it correctly, as it did with the coal investments, then we could end up having these stranded assets. So that's really the case that I'm putting forward. Now, the position, as is properly stated in the paper, is that at the moment the position of, and of course, it's Bradford Council who administer the fund on behalf of West Yorkshire authorities, and also have a number of other, there are a number of other authorities that buy into that as well. Actually, buy into the services of West Yorkshire Pension Fund to administer the fund. At the moment, the position has been that there's a lot of work going on and a lot of talk about this, and there's no rest for the wicked, I'm afraid, with the people that run the fund, because we keep on them about it. We need to do something about it. They have commissioned a report from Aon Consultants, which has set out very clearly that we have to do something. At the moment, the I think there are many people involved in the administration of the fund who believe that the best thing that we can do is to try to engage with fossil fuel companies, to persuade them to declare what they're doing and so on and so forth, but that retention of the investments, which permits one to engage or to vote at AGMs and so on, is the best way forward. I and a number of other people, a number of other colleagues, don't think that that's the case. It's not sufficient, and it doesn't do anything about the fiduciary risk we have of having stranded assets in the fund, which eventually end up being worth hardly anything at all. So the reason why this has been brought here is, in a sense, we're following on from a similar resolution which was passed by our sister organisation on Leeds City Council, proposed by Councillor Andrew Scopes there. So we're really saying that, you know, we as a council, you know, the council contributes a great deal of money to that. Council employees contribute a great deal of money into that. So if we can demonstrate that there is strong concern, then we believe that over time, quite hopefully before too long, we will be able to persuade the management of the fund that this is something which has to be taken seriously, and a proper divestment pathway going forward over the next 3 years should be adopted. I'll leave it there, Chair. I hope that's helped.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that. A lot of really helpful information there. And just for the people at home, there's just some stats to back that up in terms of the fact that over 200 million was wiped off the pension fund due to its oil investments crashing over the last 3 years. So there are some real economic reasons why this happens, and not just environmental impacts, which is obviously the main reason we're here. And you know, they obviously still have quite a large amount of investment into coal as well, which I think, as we know, is on its way out. So before we look towards any of the recommendations within the report, I'm just going to look towards some of the hands that are up, and I'm just going to take Chair's privilege again, because I don't know which way they went up, but I'm going to take Will first, and then Councillor Hutchinson, and then Councillor Baker, if that's okay. Oops, I didn't see it. You know what, Councillor Lee, sorry about that. You have your hand up also, so I'm going to take you first. Thanks for that. And then I'll move to you, Will. My apologies, Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to make an observation about Jenny's points about the pension fund. And I absolutely understand the ambitions you've described, Councillor Lynn. We're talking about investments here, and I just want to point out an alternative view that might prevail, that might actually change the investment opportunities that you're discussing. So the first thing to understand is, by definition, all around the world in the next 10 years, anybody involved in exploiting hydrocarbons will not be doing so, or they'll be doing it progressively less and less, because all of the cars are going to have to be electric soon. We know that. So they won't actually be engaging as much in exploiting fossil fuels as they have in the past. Oh, and incidentally, for Councillor Patient, I think the blip on the prices of Shell and BP is a very great deal more than 200 million. It's probably more like 20 billion. You know, I mean, they've really been affected. So it's fair to say that, but if you're going to make the point, it is actually a lot more that they've gone down, and that's relevant. So they will, by definition, be using less fossil fuels. So that will, you know, naturally decrease because of all the other actions that are being taken. Now, these are very big companies, and companies don't just rest on the laurels. They know as well as we do that market will be disappearing soon for them. And it's highly likely that they'll get involved in far more friendly operations, for example, battery cars and other things, massive investments. So the thing to think about, I think, before getting involved in clever investment decisions is what would the effect be on the Yorkshire pension funds? Because right now, the price of those stocks as somebody said, and I mentioned, have gone down a lot recently. Well, they've actually, in fairness, they've gone down a lot more than that. They're at very low levels for those companies because of the situation. So just realise, like when Gordon Brown sold the gold, if you divest of these stocks, you'll be divesting of them at a very low level. And the chances are, in the future, they will be a rising stock because they will be getting into other things to do, which will be far more environmentally friendly. And the values are likely to rise very, very much from a low position. So in fact, it could well be, and I'm on behalf of the pensioners, if you like, that divesting of the stock at a low level now, when their exploitation of these hydrocarbons is minimizing anyway, could be a very poor investment decision. So I think it's not just the way as described, it's far more complex. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Always good to get a different view of things. Sorry, I couldn't see your digital hand because of your beige background. It was sort of blending in, so I wasn't purposefully excluding you. Off to, thank you. I think it was you I said next, Will.
Because obviously you mentioned that this is going to be like a sort of 3-year divestment. So I think and I understand where Councillor Lee's coming from, and it makes a lot of sense. You sort of don't want to sell off all your stock, when it's at its lowest. But there's a good chance in the coming years, as we come out of COVID, that they're probably going to rise anyway. Also, I think as we go beyond that, we do run a risk of, with COP26 coming on, and when we talk about green jobs, a lot of which will probably rely on the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, we sort of we've got a chance, well, probably a very high chance of just undoing a lot of the work we want to do. Because we can do a lot of good, and we want to do a lot of good, but if that's all just sort of underpinned by the pension fund, it does it diminishes the work we're doing. And I think we need to be very careful about making sure that it doesn't do that, and making sure that the transition is not as clean as possible, but it maintains the level of the fund and doesn't make it go down as it has done recently.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that, Will. Much appreciated. Councillor Hutchinson.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier this week, East Sussex Pension Fund announced that it would be divesting from fossil fuel investments. So this obviously isn't unique to the Yorkshire Pension Fund. But I would say that the writing has been on the wall for these major fossil fuel companies for many, many, many years. And yet they've chosen to persist with trying to squeeze as much as possible out of their existing investments in deposits and developing major pipelines and the like to allow them to do that. So I really do think that if they were going to be planning to become major players in green energy solutions at any time soon, they would have started quite a long time ago and have something to show for it. I do think that there will be a huge number of opportunities available to invest in rising green energy stocks from a number of different sources. And to be able to make those investments, you need to reduce your holdings in other fields. And so a strategy of divestment over a 3-year period would allow you to catch that rising tide. So I would hope that we back the recommendations on this paper.
Thank you, Councillor Hutchinson. I'm going to try and remain impartial during this chat, so not come back at specific issues. But you're next, Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, there's some really interesting debates around disinvestment. I think it is complicated because, you know, it's easy to imagine a fossil fuel company, but a lot of companies have some work in fossil fuels that then do other things, and companies change. So it's actually harder to define it, what is or isn't a fossil fuel company, than it might at first seem. So it isn't a simple thing. And then there's, you know, there's investments, there's your responsibility to the pension funds, because they're already, you know, a lot of them have kind of problems as well in terms of meeting the people who are going to be claiming on pensions in the future. And you have to kind of weigh up the ethics of that and those people along with the climate. I mean, I do think you need ethical investment strategies. And I think that makes actually sound investment sense, as well as you know, it being the ethical thing to do. I don't think you can completely separate, you know, what makes money from the environment, because obviously we're all reliant on the environment for our kind of economic and well-being and stuff. So I guess I don't want to contribute any further than that to the debate around disinvestment. I you know, support a call for it, but it is more complicated than some people make out, and there are some pretty well-rehearsed debates on either side around that if people go and look at what various people have said on it. What interests me more, I guess, is the bits and the recommendation around what we can do ourselves, because the investment fund is separate by trustees, but I guess we as an authority can take ownership of things within our power and our own investment strategies. So one thing that has concerned me in recent years was the arrangement we came with Stoblitz Energy for collecting biomass from our woodlands in Calderdale, and then that being burnt. I mean, there's some interesting documentaries out there about how biomass is becoming the new coal, and I'm not sure how sustainable it is. So actually, I think things like that are a little bit questionable, with our own woodland is going and being collected by an energy company and then just being turned into wood pellets and burnt. That is releasing CO2 into the environment here in Calderdale. Also, I know, you know, I've raised this previously, the factory-owned land that then has a petrol station on it, I think is also questionable. I know we've had this one before, I'm not rehashing that, but that's an opportunity for positive change. You know, okay, the past is the past. And so what excites me, I think, is that recommendation relates to the council's own investments and things that we can control. And I'd hope that when it comes to cabinet, that point about our woodland being turned into woodland pellets gets picked up, and we re-examine that woodland strategy and see whether we can shift a bit of a change there to something which is going to be even better for our CO2 emissions as a borough. So I will support this, but I do think, you know, that's the pension trust is separate. We can only influence it. We can't make a decision for them, but we can, I guess, as a council, do things here in Calderdale that are within our control, and we can make a difference there.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Yeah, I'm not going to get into the to and fro about the petrol station or land, but I think you make some good points there, specifically around just some of that counter narrative, and clearly the idea about biomass is rehearsed on a national level. We have the Drax train tumbling through the Calder Valley twice daily, and I think we could probably chat all day about the benefits or not. I know where I sit on it, but perhaps this isn't the forum to have that discussion. Yeah, you mentioned that there are some other sort of aspects within the recommendations we make, and clearly, no matter what recommendation we make, this is just a recommendation to Cabinet. We're not going to be waving a magic wand, and things aren't going to necessarily happen overnight. This is just a stance based on what this group collectively broadly thinks. Councillor Lynn, sorry.
Thanks, yeah, so no, just to come back on that. So I think I'd like, you know, in terms of investment, also looking at, I guess that point about the biomass, if that could be at least picked up by Cabinet in the recommendation, or that we've raised it as an issue, and then Cabinet can at least consider it then.
Yeah, very much so. We'll make sure that happens. And hopefully you'll come and comment on that particular item if and or when it does come to Cabinet. Councillor Lynn, I see your hand is up.
Yes, I wondered if I might just come back to one or two of the really good points, and thanks for everybody for getting involved. I mean, there's some very good points there. I think, yes, I mean, I think Stephen, Councillor Lee, yes, you're absolutely right that that, you know, it may, and I think somebody else, I think Reagan Councillor Dickinson also pointed to the fact that some of the oil majors and so on are starting to, starting to make noises about how they may very well want to reposition themselves to become more involved in, in alternatives and perhaps in renewables and so on. As far as I'm aware, there's only one of the oil majors that has actually made the transition, and that would be the Danish sovereign oil fund, which became Dong Energy, and it's now not even listed as an oil company in international exchanges. But the other majors have all made. Councillor Dickens is absolutely right. They've all made statements about their aspiration to move to decarbonise their operations and so on. But the horizons that they've got are very, very long, and I think people may very well be quite familiar with the term greenwashing. It's not whitewashing; it's greenwashing. And I think that there are many people who would argue that some of our, major oil and gas companies are actually guilty of that, of greenwashing, that they talk the talk, but so far there has been very little evidence that they've been walking the walk. The other point I would say about the point that Councillor Lee mentioned about we don't want to sell stocks when they're really low. Yeah, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. But that's precisely why what we have asked, and they haven't yet acceded to our request, but what Councillor Scopes from Leeds and I have asked is that we should actually commission some professional advice as to what a 3-year progressive strategy might look like. Because obviously, if you're giving yourself that kind of a time frame, then you can progressively move, move your investments across. The other thing to say is that in information that we've had from to the investment advisory panel recently has indicated that although at the moment the fund has relatively small a relatively small range of investments in renewable energy, they are actually outperforming those ones that we do have. They are actually outperforming quite a lot of the rest of the stocks that the fund has. So given, and particularly given the announcement by the Chancellor today about which I think is parts of which I don't agree with at all, but parts of which are certainly to be welcomed. It's quite clear that the general thrust going forward is going to be towards it's strengthening our investment in renewable energy and so on. So I think there are lots of opportunities coming up. So I think that the opportunity to, as we do, I mean, we buy and sell stocks all the time, and that's what the panel has to look at, what the officers have been doing. And you're constantly kind of, trying to position yourself so that you're getting the best return and everything. So what this is doing, as far as the pension fund is concerned, is encouraging them to look at it's not just a negative thing about getting out of oil majors. It's as Councillor Hutchinson mentioned, it's also about taking up the opportunities that are coming to divert that money into where it's going to be doing some good for the climate, but critically, it's going to be supporting the pension fund. And just finally, I mean, I welcome what Councillor Baker's comments about about our own the council's own investment and the need to question biomass and so on. I think that's right. And the other point that I think Councillor Baker was saying was, is there a trade-off between the right returns, the best returns for the pensioners, and doing right by our climate objectives? And I don't think there is a trade-off. I think that's the whole point. I mean, I've not, at no point have I made the argument in the investment panel that what we're doing is, we're not interested in getting the best returns. It's precisely because I want the best returns that I don't want us to be continuing to invest in risky stocks in the long term. And if we miss the tipping point, remember what I said about Wall Street and the horses that became cars. If we miss the tipping point, then we could be ending up, as Mark Carney said, with stranded assets. So I hope very much, Chair, that we take on board all the points raised in the discussion, but that this group will feel able to make that recommendation that relates both to the pension fund investments, but also to our own investments going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lynn. Is there anyone else that hasn't yet spoken that wants to come in on that before we? I think we've had some really interesting debate on that particular issue that's been really helpful, specifically stuff from Councillor Baker there about some of the points that we should be thinking about if and when indeed it comes to Cabinet. And I think that's really important that we consider those in the sort of broader thing. But I'm looking at the time. I guess it might be helpful at this point to think about whether this working party wants to consider the recommendations in the report. There's 3 recommendations in there, so I guess we'd just take them on block. And I note that we've got 11 voting members. I may have got that wrong, but I've done a quick head count and it looks like we've got 11 voting members in the digital room. No, I'm getting a shaky head there from Jez. So would you like to update me with the real number?
Janet, would you be able to inform the chair? You're on mute, Janet.
Hello, Chair. If you look at your agenda, it advises you who can vote and who can't.
You're going to have me open multiple pages now, aren't you? And go back.
It's basically members of the council. So
Okay.
it's the actual members of the board that are councillors
Fine.
that
Okay.
can cast a vote.
Yeah, it's. Sorry, one moment. Yeah, I did mention that, Anthony, broadly earlier. I think that was covered. There was a legal advice question within there, but yeah, we've certainly been through the process of. We'll have to go through the process of going through our own legal department to get sign off before anything goes through to Cabinet, should that be what happens. So, okay, in terms of voting members then, can I ask if all voting members have their video screens on? And I guess we'll just do it by a physical show of hands. So do we want to accept the recommendations of this report and send this to Cabinet? Shall we do that vote now? So anyone who wants to do it, could you just raise your hands if it's an aye? Okay, and any nays? And any abstentions? Okay. I move that past. But like I say, thank you. It's not the end of this discussion. Clearly, should it go to Cabinet, if it's passed through legal, there'll be chance for robust discussion within that forum as well, and perhaps to pick up some of the points mentioned by Councillor Lee specifically and echoed by Councillor Dickinson, as well as some of the specifics mentioned by Councillor Baker as well within there. So thank you. I think that was a good and helpful discussion. Clearly not one we're going to solve overnight, but perhaps one we can come back to and have a good chat about. So there are 2 more items there. It's now 10 to 8. I think a lot of the bits and bobs that were discussed in the general chat about Wicker have been covered, about the Green Economy Panel, some work on the emission reduction pathway, and other sectors. If there's anything specific people want to pull out from that, then please do. Just to say that in the flooding update, there was an awful lot of news about the investment that's coming to Calderdale specifically, and other investment that's due to come this way. So I'd ask people, if they're interested, to look at that report. It's readily available on the Wicker website, and there's some quite interesting bits. Calderdale features very, very heavily and quite prominently in the flooding update, as you can all quite imagine. But interesting to see some of the new funding opportunities and projects that may or may not be coming our way, likely will be coming our way. So I'm going to skip that specifically, unless anyone has a question on it, and go to the any other business section. Does anyone have anything else for anything else? Sam?
Yeah, I've just got a really short one. I think something we possibly haven't updated the group on is the bid that was done for the National Lottery for some some of their climate action fund was partially successful. So we didn't get the £2.3 million that we hoped for. However, Todd Community College was successful in getting £269,000 to help them look at starting up new climate education in Todmorden. And the council, in partnership with Calder Rivers Trust, got £307,000 for a project to work with landowners and also to set up a new sphagnum growing nursery to look at trialling growing sphagnum here in Calderdale that can then be used to restore the moorlands. So that's a really good piece of news by some of our community groups I wanted to share. And then also just to mention that the council has signed up to the UK 100, which is a sort of national race to zero pledge, which is focused on local authorities in the public sector. And it's part of it is actually the pledges that were there as divestment pledges, but there were themed pledges that we'll be making across a number of different kind of activities to reflect the work we have going on in all sorts of sectors, from waste to transport, to look at going low carbon. And we'll bring back maybe a further update to the group on that in the future. And Councillor Tim Swift actually did a lovely statement to go with our commitment to the UK Race to Zero project, which went out on Twitter and on social media around the time of the Storm Ciara anniversary communication. So all of that climate activity was tied into the Storm Ciara 1 year after the event communications, which I thought was really good. Good work by the communications team to tie those two things together and talk about climate risk and our sort of actions to try and tackle that.
Brilliant, thank you. I've seen a number of hands. I don't know how many are legacy. Shall I pick them and you can shake your head or nod? Councillor Baker. Right, Finn.
Yeah. Just three quick things. The Committee on Climate Change has an event coming up on adaptation, and that is just as important as our mitigation efforts. So if you're interested in that, please do follow them. And all their previous sessions have been recorded and are available. Kevin Fryer from Lancaster City Council is starting his events too on the climate emergency, and he had them last year and they were excellent, and we could learn a lot from them. And he's starting a new series this month, if you are interested. And thirdly, could I just mention that a new non-party political group called Calderdale Green New Deal has been established. And they recently held a conference, and I think there were 120 participants and a lot of energy in there. So I think there's an audience out there where we can reach out to. I don't know, it looks like Hazel has left. No, Hazel might still be here, but she can say more about it if she wants to.
Go on, Hazel, we'll give you the floor for a minute.
Sorry, I've frozen. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, that's the main thing.
All right. Yeah, Green New Deal kind of combines the two things about looking after people, making a just transition and creating jobs in the climate sector and so on, as well as the climate crisis. So those two crises coming together, and we cover all of Calderdale, and we meet on Thursdays. Yeah, anybody who wants to get involved can do, totally non-partisan. So all parties are really welcome to join us as well.
Thank you, Hazel, and we hope that Green New Deal keep engaging with this group and other aspects of the council and other things as well. So thanks for coming along, much appreciated. Yeah, thanks for mentioning those bits, Finn. Kevin Free's talks are well worth checking into. I've done some work for him before, and just to mention the Committee on Climate Change 6th Carbon Budget webinars are well worth a watch for anyone on this committee. Really good and really helpful. Anthony, did you have a quick hand up?
I just realised Councillor Patient, when I was talking about opportunities to communicate, I froze and I lost my audio. So I just thought I'd check. Was what I heard? Did you hear what I said, or should I put something in writing later on?
I think we caught it, but it can't hurt to put it in writing just to be sure. So thank you, appreciated. Okay, if that's everything, just to say particular thank you to our committee admin who've been, doing absolute hurdles and have been, jumping and weaving this way and that. I'm a bit of an auteur when it comes to trying to chair these meetings. So I've got a lot to learn, and I'm sure I'll get my hands slapped. So thank you for bearing with us on that one. And just to welcome and say thank you to all the new people tuning in. Appreciate your input, and especially to Paveen, who's had to leave us now. Hopefully her input will be really valuable going forward. So thank you for everything. We will pick up all of the questions we were asked and try and get those answers to you as soon as possible. And we will see you back here next time. Please look out for the minutes and details of the next meeting. Go and enjoy the rest of your evening.